to introduce Dympna Devine. Dympna is the Professor of Education in UCD and Head of the School of Education. She's the founding member of UCD Childhood and Human Development Research Centre and is internationally known for her huge body of work and research on children's voice, citizenship and migrant children's identities and experiences. So thank you very much, Dympna.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Hello, and well done for coming here on a Saturday morning. And I'm hoping that, in a way, some of the work that I'm going to talk about will build very nicely, actually, on what Madeleine has talked about. So the title is Securing Migrant Children's Education and Wellbeing, and through policy and practice in Irish schools. And so I'm just going to maybe start off by talking about valuing migrant children differently. And I've done a lot of work on the area of migrant children in Irish education. I came to it actually as an area of research at the end of the 1990s, and I was working with student teachers who were going out into schools, and the whole demographic context of those schools was changing, because that really was when we began to have a sea change in the kinds of patterns of immigration and emigration that were happening here. And there was no research in the Irish context in education. There was plenty of research in the UK, in the US, that I was drawing on for my lectures, but there was nothing that was telling me about the reality of what was going on in the Irish system. And that's really what has become, in a way, a lifelong project since, and I'll talk more about that at the end. But what I've really worked on increasingly is that notion of valuing, and a sort of a double play on the meaning of the word value and valuing that I hope will become clear as we move through. I've picked out 3 quotes from children and young people that I've talked to over the years that have resonated with me. I don't know how many of you have ever done research with children, but there are times when you're doing this kind of work and somebody says something and you're going, that really encapsulates so much. So the first one was a quote from a Vietnamese Irish student who actually was second generation living here in Ireland. And in the school that he was in, he talks about that it's almost like you have to hide, it's like living another life, in terms of that disjunction between his home life and his life in school. And for me, that highlights issues around recognition and the recognition of cultural identity. The second was a quote actually from an Irish traveller girl. And of course, travellers have been in the media in the last week. And what she said was, "Girls in my class don't know I'm a traveller, I'm ashamed." And so what we have there is the profound psychic dimension of cultural identity. And what that links into is issues around visibility and the extent to which you are ashamed to be who you are, or whether you feel there's a very negative attribution towards that. And the third one was a quote actually from a Syrian refugee. And she talks about colour and skin colour, and how it was only when she moved to Ireland that she became conscious of colour and actually different kinds of colours. And her own interpretation of it, I thought, was wonderful. Her own sense making of how identity is defined in terms of colour. And what that links in for me are issues about power and who has the power to define what coloured is and who is coloured. And so I want to broaden, and I'll weave those sort of ideas in through the rest of the presentation, and we'll come back to it, but I just want to broaden it a little bit and situate some of the things that we're talking about in terms of migration, and working on this idea of migrant children as what I would call productive citizens. And obviously we're living in a very rapidly changing Europe and patterns of global migration. And those patterns of global migration have to be understood in the broader macro context, in competition states competing for talent, and looking at migration and the value of migration in terms of what it adds to the talent pool within any given society. So migrant children are valued as potential, flexible, mobile workers, particularly in ageing societies. So ageing societies are particularly concerned about the demographic patterns and the fact that they will not have enough young people who are being born to be able to support older people and increasingly elderly population. And migration and attitudes towards migration need to be understood within that context also. So on the one hand, bringing in migrants, bringing in refugees, we can see that very clearly actually in terms of what happened in Europe, adds to the potential labour pool of the future, and that's perceived to be a positive thing. But at the same time, there are threats to cohesion and the marketability of the society, and I'll talk about that specifically in relation to education. And in schools, those tensions give rise to what I call productive or pedagogic tensions. And those two tensions are built around education is perceived to be a firewall against a lack of integration. So education is about fixing the ethnic others, those who have come into the settlement society who are different and need to be fixed to become like us. And the other tension, the other perspective, is education as a good in and of itself. And education about valuing, and that sort of connects in with what Madeline was talking about, the more holistic approach to the child. So just sort of keep those two tensions, education as fixing, and fixing something that's perceived to be wrong, or education as valuing. The last thing in terms of maybe putting that wider macro context is again to look at global policy. If we go a little bit deeper, we can see that there are wider policy dynamics at play in the discourses of education. And the OECD has been particularly influential on what's happening internationally across education systems. And the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, has a very explicit focus on the development of human capital through education systems in order to enhance productivity and competition between member states. And therefore, education is predominantly seen as a form of human capital and social investment and development. And we see this particularly in PISA. How many of you have heard of PISA, the PISA studies, just as a matter of interest? Okay, like 15 years ago you wouldn't have known what PISA was, but PISA has actually a direct impact on what happens within school systems, because governments look to see where their ranking is on different subjects and then implement change in terms of that ranking. We have that very explicitly in the Irish education system through the development of a national policy on literacy and numeracy that happened after the fall in scores of Ireland in the PISA results of 2009. New national literacy strategy was rolled out in 2011 as a direct response to that. So it does have very real consequences for the development of policy at local level in countries. And so what has that got to do with children? What it does is it heightens the sense of performance and the measurement of performance within the education system. It also gives rise to the idea of what a good child is. A good child is a child who is productive and who is performing within the education system. And if we look at it in the wider context of the society's needs, it is a child, and look at this in relation to migrant children, and Madeline referred to the range of languages that you will often get. It is a child who is flexible, mobile and self-responsible and will make a contribution to the wider economic development of that society. But we also have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Okay, so what's the kind of discourse that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is promoting in relation to education? It is actually about defining the rights of children, irrespective of their status, to education. And it also has a very holistic approach to the purpose of education. It also has provisions in relation to non-discrimination, in serving the best interests of the children who attend the school system, and also in ensuring that children have a voice in decisions that directly affect them in their everyday lives. And therefore the UN Convention provides a tablet or a template for what is considered to be a good childhood rather than necessarily a good child. And it is a good childhood is one where the child is valued and has a holistic experience of their education everyday lives. So if we look at that then and apply those specifically to migrant children, there are certain key questions that can be raised. The first is, am I only valued if I add value? If I am bad, do I add value? Do I only add value if I am good relative to all other children? And what counts in my well-being? How am I defined and understood within the education system? And a lot of this and a lot of my work would have been in this area has been very much influenced by the work of Pierre Bourdieu, among others. So I'm just going to put up two key quotes, if you like, that highlight where some of this is based. And we look on education as a field of power and struggle. And the central notion within that is that it's a field of struggle where actors, key people within the education system, struggle for the preservation or for the transformation of the field. So children within the education system are required to act upon themselves, but also there are adults within the education system, parents, teachers, school principals, community workers, resource teachers, etc. And they are caught in that web of tension between, are we going to transform our school? And Madeleine talked about the issue of empowerment. Are we going to change our school, or are we going to preserve what it is we know and understand? And I'm presenting those not as absolutes, but rather as tensions that everybody who's working in the field is actually dealing with in different ways. And how they deal and cope with it will, of course, be dependent on the kind of resources that they draw on. The second key element is the whole notion of how you position yourselves within that field. And Bourdieu has the idea of habitus. And essentially, it's the extent to which you feel like a fish in water, or you feel the weight of the water on top of you. So when you are in an environment that you feel absolutely comfortable in, you move through it very seamlessly, like a fish moving through water. If you are in an environment that is different for you, then you are like a fish out of water, and you struggle, you can't breathe, etc. And we can take that analogy as far as it goes. So again, just sort of hold on to those ideas when I go through maybe more applied elements of these issues as they apply to the Irish school system and working with migrant children in the system. So we can think about that in terms of the field of migration and schooling in Ireland. And we can see there on the left-hand side, that's just the graph showing the alternating patterns of migration. And we can see clearly how migration reached a peak in 2008, and that was just prior to the economic collapse. Yeah? And we can see how migration began to fall and emigration began to increase, because Ireland is obviously a country that has a historical legacy of emigration and returning immigration from those who already had a very strong connection with Ireland. That's what changed in the past 20 years. And we can see that the levels of immigration are increasing as the economy has started to develop and expand again. So we have a population of 4.86 million, which is a population that is increasing since the foundation of the state. We have 12% of the population are defined as other than Irish. So the biggest groups are actually those who come from the UK, from the EU 13, and then the rest of the world. And of course, the biggest immigrant group within Irish society are actually those who come from Poland. The estimates of what's present in terms of the education system are about approximately 12% of the school-going population are of migrant background. But I say that is an underestimate, because it really is how you define what a migrant child is. and the extent to which you are talking about children who were born in another country, their parents were born in another country, whether they are of mixed heritage themselves. So we have greater levels of ethnic diversity within the school system by virtue actually of the embeddedness now of migration in our society and the embeddedness of ethnic diversity. And I'll talk again about the statistics and the availability of statistics in relation to ethnicity and migration in the Irish education system. But I think the key point is we have increasing diversity in what is a faith-based, state-funded system. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but we also know that there are patterns of geographic clustering, and we have elements of segregation within our school system in relation to ethnicity that is linked in not only to the demographic clustering in certain communities, but also to do with the faith basis of the system, because there's a very strong connection between faith and ethnicity. Refugees, we know there's a highly restrictive asylum system. And from a general pattern point of view, we had a boom. We saw that reflected in the table. We had one of the most severe busts, and now we are going back to boom again. One of the things about the patterns of migration is that migrants that come through the formal system are those who tend to be fairly highly educated. And the government has had a very strategic policy on attracting migrants who will work in the health, IT and pharmaceutical sectors. So all of that is connected into competition states and where Ireland is positioning itself in terms of the global economy. So the general trends then of that kind of policy and patterns is that migrants tend to have a very high level of education within Ireland. So high levels of parental education, and the average levels of education among the migrant population, it's often called the non-Irish national population, are actually higher than the Irish national population. However, what we are, the data that we do have focuses very much on issues to do with language acquisition, as Madeline was talking about, indicates relative underperformance of these children within the school system. And some of that can be interpreted in terms of clustering in disadvantaged schools. We also have to look at the impact of the economic crisis and the impact that that had on the provision, for example, of support services to children of immigrant backgrounds, including children of refugee backgrounds within the education system. And the final issue is issues around faith segregation and rights of access to local Catholic schools, and we can talk about that towards the end if we get time. So you can see it's a fairly complex area, and in looking at it, if you start in the centre there with children's rights and well-being, that is a very central focus of my own work in terms of studying education, is the extent to which children's experience of school actually enhances their rights as defined under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and their well-being. But there are multiple layers that happen within that child's life that influence how well they're going to do within school. And I often use, so you've got the children's practices, which is their own social worlds. You have that embedded within teacher practices in school and parent practices in the home. It's embedded further in the leadership practices within schools and school cultures. What happens within schools and leadership is actually hugely informed by national policies in the area. And then what happens in national policies is hugely influenced by what happens in EU and global policies. And a really good example of that is actually what's happened around literacy and numeracy and PISA. So PISA came from OECD policies, which is up at the global level. That feeds into national policies on literacy and numeracy and a national rollout of a literacy and numeracy strategy. That feeds into what schools need to do around literacy and numeracy. That feeds into what teachers and parents need to do around the area. And that feeds into children themselves increasingly becoming aware of how they are performing and ranked against other children in their classroom and school. So let's take each of those, or some of those. Let's see how time goes. So if we look at children's practices, children are key to the mobilisation of the life chances for the family. It is through the work that children do in school that they continue on the trajectory of the family that they have been born into, or that they will actually alter it. When a family moves through migration, they are moving with the intention of improving the life chances of their family. Often within refugee situations or within economic migration, you will get one person of the family who will move first, and they will settle and they will try and create a situation where they can bring the wider family, and there's huge issues there around unification. But what we often forget about is the key role that children actually play in that process. So it's through the children themselves being successful or unsuccessful within the school system that actually will determine the long-term trajectory of that family within the settlement society. They are active negotiators of culture and identity, and they engage in love, care and solidarity practices. What does that mean? They engage in connecting and building connections between the family and the settlement society through their work in school. Any of you who are parents and have children going to schools will know that often the best friends you will make as a parent are through the friends that your children have. And children are the central focus point there, and it is the very same for migrant children. It is the friendships that they make in school or not make that will actually act as a bridge connecting the new family in that local community to other families in that local community, which is why schools are actually so important to communities. And here we have the children talking about, for example, the connection and the importance of their family to them as they try to include and integrate themselves within the local school. No matter what, you will always be loved by your family. The second quote by, I can't read that, by Heidi, who was from Pakistan, she talked actually about moving between two home spaces when she went back to Pakistan over the summer period, and she integrated with her family there, and then when she came back to Ireland and integrated with the friends that she had made in Ireland. So migrant children are also strategic and very pragmatic in their approaches to school. They have an ideal type of positioning, which means, and it links into that notion of behaviour, they are very conscious that they are the representative of their family within this local and within this new community. And there is a very strong sense of gratitude and appreciation for the opportunities that they receive. However, gratitude is a little bit of a double-edged sword, because to be grateful is in a way to sort of acknowledge that you are coming from a different position than the person who is in power. So gratitude, as I say, is a double-edged sword. And I often talk about learning as a form of social practice, which is reflected in this comment and a quote, and this is a quote going way back, but it shows the sort of dynamics that are occurring between traditional Irish children, majority ethnic children, and a girl called Ava. And Ava was from Nigeria. So I just want you to have a look at that conversation. And what are the key issues that emerge in that excerpt of a conversation between the children? The key things that come out of it. So the first thing is that Ava is labelled as being racist because Ava isn't sharing some of her school things with children, other children in the class, white children. And what's interesting in that is those children interpret that as racist behaviour, and that's what we call a form of inverse racism. But when we go down a little bit further, Ava is actually excelling academically in school. In excelling academically in school, she is making herself quite visible. She is standing out. And she's standing out in a way she's actually learning her Irish better than the Irish kids had done. And so there's a real dual play there on what does it mean to be Irish, and who is it that actually has the right to become really good at Irish. And it is one of the things actually that teachers will tell you, that often children who are coming from these diverse countries with multilingual skills are actually very, very quick at picking up Irish, which is an interesting play on it. I'm very conscious of time, Hilary, so if we look at parent practices, the key issue for parents and migrant parents, refugee parents, is the access that they have to resources. What do they have economically, culturally and socially that's going to support them in actually being included and including themselves within the settlement society? And a key issue is understanding what Bourdieu calls the logics of practice in the field. In other words, how do the fish swim in this country? How can I become a fish who will swim in the waters here and not feel it as something that I'm not comfortable with or that I can't fully breathe in? And so we have this Pakistani mum who actually worked as a midwife in a local hospital. And she talks about, she had the confidence, she had the wherewithal to actually go and make sure she got to know teachers by being on one of the parent committees. And then she knew that teachers would begin to know who she was, and therefore that would have a positive influence on her own child's experience. But that took a high level of education, confidence, and a sense of expectation of what would happen in order to improve things for her child. But we do have normative assumptions around being Irish, white, and Catholic within Irish society. And so we see this by a Nigerian dad who was in Silverwood Primary, and he talks about not actually wanting to be too visible in the local community. And I think it's very interesting that he talks about we would prefer to be in the shell. So that sense of withdrawing and link back to what I talked about at the start in terms of recognition, visibility and power. And so there's always a big challenge for migrant parents in sustaining the identities that they have come from, while also making sure that their children, knowing that in order for their children to succeed in the society, they will need to integrate, they will need to take on, if you like, the culture that they are now being educated in. And this was a quote from Amira, who was from Ghana, her dad, and he says, she's really proud to be what Irish people are supposed to be like, to be the power, which is a very interesting acknowledgement of power dynamics. Teacher practices, I'm not going to have time to go into them too much, but teachers, generally speaking, in Irish schools actually speak quite positively about their experience with migrant children. But a huge amount of that is actually to do with the very positive disposition and demeanour of children in the classroom and an expectation that they will work hard and they will learn. However, there are also clearly classed and racialised perceptions among teachers that's reflected, for example, in a sense that perhaps many of these migrants who are coming, these refugees, are coming from more affluent circumstances within their own families. Sometimes the very capacity to make a move signals your capacity to draw on resources in your home country, and that this was something that was perceived to be positive then in terms of coming to Irish society. There are contradictions between the aspirations and the practices that teachers had. In other words, teachers wanted to make a positive difference to the children. Madeleine talked about compassion and about care, and certainly that was evident among teachers that we interviewed. But we also had evidence of contradictions between how teachers spoke about their practice and actually what was observed in their practice. And that's reflected also in some of the insecurities and vulnerabilities that teachers themselves felt in dealing with the level of ethnic diversity that was now prevalent in Irish classrooms. There are important issues here around the quality of the education experience that migrant children will receive in the classroom, and issues to do with equality. And I've talked about that before. And that links in hugely to expectations. And that links in hugely to issues around segregation, because there can be a lowering of expectations for what is possible for children when you have real challenges within the school and within that wider school community just in coping with everyday life. And there are very important equality issues there. And again, there are some of the comments that the teachers made that we won't have time to go into in too much. But that issues for any professionals, I think, working in social care services, in education services, and health services, there are always challenges around time, around resources, and also around the professional development of the people who are implementing the policy. We can talk about leadership and school ethos. Is it actually a question of managing for diversity or leading for diversity? And again, some comments there from school principals that highlight some of the challenges that they had. And always there is that question of risk and reputation in the valuing of migrant children. What does that mean? That means that when a school reaches out to others, reaches out to minorities, in an increasingly competitive education system, there is a risk to the reputation of the school that it will be defined as that school. And the same issue applies actually to schools that want to work with children with a range of additional support needs. They become identified as that's the school you send your child to, if that's the way your child is, but this is the school we want to send our child to. So all of those dynamics are there and are real issues for schools when they're trying to work with and embrace diversity. So to conclude, schools are located in a complex nexus of power relations in the wider society. Schools are not neutral. There is a huge amount going on in schools that is a microcosm of actually what's happening within the wider society. The tensions, debates, challenges that exist within the wider society are played out on an everyday basis in schools, in the choices and decisions that are made, in how the children interact with each other, in how the parents do or do not speak to each other outside the school gates. And the question is there a conditionality to who we value in the education system and what we value? Do we value those who are most affiliated to the norm, who behave well, who have positive dispositions and demeanour? And what does that mean then for children who are not like that? Is there a conditionality to how we will value and welcome? And there are real dilemmas for schools around risk, reputation and value in a competitively structured education marketplace. We do not have the league ranking of schools in Ireland at primary level in the same way as they would have in other contexts, including the UK. We do have increasing ranking of second level schools, not through the ranking of the schools per se, but through ranking in terms of entry to the higher education system. And really what counts is access to resources in a period of state retraction. So the extent to which the state retracts in the level of investment and support it will make in education, or the extent to which it will actually invest in education, particularly in the earlier years, because that sets the foundation for actually how children are going to flourish and thrive within the system. And finally, being differently valued, you can value differently. It's how do you differently value different children. It's not about saying every child is the same, but it is actually about recognising that there is difference there and valuing that difference. It is a tension between transformation, which is empowerment, or preservation, the fixing of failure. Is that actually what the challenge of education is? It requires what I would call deep pedagogies that are embedded in the habitus, for those of you who are teachers, and it is around a project of self. When you are looking at issues to do with ethnic diversity, it is as much about yourself as it is about the ethnic other. So ethnic diversity and issues around the education of minority ethnic children is also about the education of majority ethnic children. It is about realising rights to quality and equality, and it is about having an education system that is careful, nurturing, but also challenging and extending. So it isn't just about loving children, it's also about having an education that challenges and extends them and doesn't actually take away from a sense of expectation of what they can achieve. And schools, of course, can make a difference, but they can't make all the difference. And this is where the UN Convention is actually hugely important. And I'll leave you with two comments. The first is a question that was asked to me by a student in my class after I'd done a whole course on equalities in education, and at the end the student said, what has social justice got to do with pedagogy? I'm a teacher, what's that got to do with social justice? And it was a really, really good question, and we had a lot of discussion around it, but it's actually quite fundamental to actually what we're doing in education. And then Mr. Dempsey, who was a very influential principal and somebody that I was very inspired about in terms of his own work in the school. And he really grappled with the changes that were taking place in his school. And he looked at the prejudices they had themselves, and that's around actually looking at yourself as well as looking at the other. Thank you.